The European theater of World War II is defined by a brutal and unrelenting struggle, where the fate of millions hinges on the ruthless tactics employed by both sides. For British soldiers, the front line is a grim reality of trench warfare, relentless bombardments, and the ever-present threat of death. It is against this backdrop that a small British infantry unit, drawn from diverse backgrounds and different walks of life, finds itself caught in a harrowing conflict that will test their endurance and sense of humanity. This group of soldiers, led by Lieutenant Douglas, is tasked with holding a key position during a violent skirmish near the Western Front. But as the sounds of gunfire echo across the battlefield, the reality of their situation becomes all too clear. The British forces are overrun, and the unit is captured. Taken by surprise and outnumbered, the soldiers have no choice but to surrender, their weapons useless in the face of the advancing German forces. The surrender is swift and inevitable, and within hours, they find themselves prisoners of war, shackled and led away from the battlefield. Their captors, cold and calculating, seem like the embodiment of the ruthless enemy they had been taught to fear and despise. The soldiers have heard the stories. The German forces are infamous for their cruelty, their brutal treatment of prisoners, their willingness to break the spirit of their enemies in any way possible. But even as they are marched through the cold, barren landscape, their minds race with disbelief, unable to fully comprehend the situation. How had this happened? How had they gone from the defenders of their homeland to the prisoners of their enemy? As the soldiers are led into the heart of the enemy's territory, the stark contrast between their previous life as free men and their current status as captives weighs heavily upon them. The camp they are brought to is vast, surrounded by high, spiked wire that seems to stretch endlessly into the distance. The wire is the first thing they notice, their prison. The realization hits them with a cruel finality. This is where they will stay for the foreseeable future. Their fate has been sealed, and the expectations of what is to come flood their minds. They had heard whispers of the horrors prisoners faced in other camps, beatings, starvation, forced labor, torture, and they prepare themselves mentally for the worst. It is a grim prospect, but they are British soldiers, hardened by years of conflict, trained to endure. They will survive, even if it costs them their humanity. But as they are thrust into the camp, something is different. The first indication that their captivity may not be as cruel as they imagined comes in the form of the guards. They are not the snarling, vicious men they had been led to expect. There is no sign of the sadistic gleam in their eyes that has been portrayed in countless stories and propaganda. The guards seem almost detached, as if they are going through the motions of their duty, without the usual malice that the soldiers had anticipated. For a moment, the prisoners are left to wonder, is this a trick? Are they simply being lulled into a false sense of security, only to be subjected to unimaginable horrors later? The camp itself is a strange place, a world unto itself. It is a self-contained unit, isolated from the rest of the war, where time seems to slow and every moment stretches out longer than the last. The soldiers are placed in barracks, the air thick with tension and the weight of their shared situation. There are no windows in the barracks, only small slits in the walls that allow a few rays of light to filter through, casting long shadows on the cold, wooden floors. The soldiers are fed, but the food is barely enough to sustain them, and there is a palpable sense of hunger that gnaws at them each day. The water they are given is dirty, a bitter reminder of the squalor they have found themselves in. The conditions are far from luxurious, but they are not what they expected either. There is no brutality, no open abuse. It is a kind of dispassionate cruelty, a cold indifference that leaves the soldiers confused and on edge. As the days pass, the soldiers begin to notice something even more unsettling. The German guards, despite their stoic demeanor, are not unkind. They provide the prisoners with basic necessities, such as blankets and clothing, when they begin to freeze in the unforgiving winter weather. There is no sign of the contempt they had expected, no sneers, no mocking laughter. Instead, there is a kind of clinical efficiency to the way they interact with the prisoners. They enforce the rules with an unwavering precision, but they do so without the venomous hatred that the British soldiers had imagined. The food is rationed carefully, and while it is sparse, it is not poisoned. The prisoners are allowed time to rest, though they are never given the luxury of peace. Instead, they are kept on edge, constantly aware of the guards' watchful eyes. Lieutenant Douglas, ever the observant leader, is perplexed by this behavior. His experience with the enemy has been shaped by the stereotypes and propaganda that have permeated British society throughout the war. He had been trained to view the German soldiers as little more than machines of war, devoid of compassion or empathy. And yet, here they are, human beings much like himself, who are not torturing him or his men, but simply going through the motions of their own grim reality. The Germans are not monsters, but men caught in the same maelstrom of conflict and suffering. The realization is both comforting and deeply disorienting. It does not fit with the narrative he has been fed, nor with the way he has been taught to view the world. The discomfort Douglas feels grows as the days turn into weeks. His men, initially fearful and distrustful, begin to adapt to the strange new normal of life in captivity. They form small, tentative bonds with the other prisoners, and in quiet moments, they share their fears and hopes for the future. Some soldiers become resigned to their fate, while others refuse to give in to despair. It is in these small moments of connection that the true nature of their experience begins to emerge. Despite the harsh conditions, despite the uncertainty of the future, there is a glimmer of something that none of them expected: humanity. It is not the humanity of their captors that they are beginning to recognize, but their own. The prisoners are not simply victims of war. They are men who are capable of kindness, of solidarity, of hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It is this realization that begins to challenge everything the soldiers thought they knew about war. They had been told that in times of conflict, there are clear lines between good and evil, between the righteous and the unjust. But as they live alongside their captors, they begin to see the war in a new light. The lines are not as clear as they once seemed. The Germans are not the faceless villains they had imagined, and the British soldiers are not the noble heroes they had been led to believe themselves to be. In this camp, in this strange, isolated world, the soldiers are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that war is not a simple matter of right and wrong. It is a complex, multifaceted tragedy, where both sides are entangled in a shared struggle for survival, for meaning, for the preservation of their humanity. As the soldiers adjust to life behind the wire, they come to understand that survival is not just about enduring the physical hardships of captivity. It is about holding on to something more elusive, more intangible: their sense of self, their sense of what is right, and just in a world that seems to have lost all sense of moral clarity. The wire that surrounds them is not just a physical barrier, it is a psychological one that keeps them trapped in a mental prison of their own making. But as they begin to see their captors as more than just enemies, as they begin to recognize their shared humanity, the wire begins to lose its power over them. They realize that their true enemy is not the Germans, but the bitterness, the hatred, and the fear that threaten to consume them from within. For Lieutenant Douglas, the realization is both a source of anguish and a source of hope. He knows that the war is far from over, and that there may be even greater hardships ahead. But he also knows that in this place, in this camp, there is something more important than the fight for survival. There is the fight for the soul, for the preservation of what makes them human in the face of an inhuman world. And as he watches his men adapt, as he sees them hold on to their humanity even in the darkest of times, he begins to believe that perhaps there is hope for them all, even in the midst of the war that surrounds them. As the days pass, the British soldiers grow accustomed to the strange, oppressive rhythm of life within the camp. The initial shock of capture begins to fade, replaced by a quiet tension that seeps into every waking moment. The camp, though large and meticulously organized, feels more like a holding pen than a place of imprisonment. The soldiers find themselves waking each day to the same sterile routine, marching from their barracks to the communal spaces, where they are given their meager rations and assigned various tasks. There is no overt cruelty, no brutal physical punishment, but instead a chilling sense of bureaucratic efficiency that strips away any illusion of freedom. The German guards, although stern and unyielding, exhibit no signs of the sadistic behavior the prisoners had been warned to expect. The cold detachment with which they carry out their duties leaves the British soldiers unsettled, unsure of how to respond to this unexpected behavior. the initial distrust between the captives and their captors remains palpable. The prisoners cannot rid themselves of the feeling that they are being watched, scrutinized with the kind of precision that only the trained eyes of soldiers possess. At first, it seems like a simple matter of the Germans maintaining control, but over time, the British begin to sense a deeper tension, one that has less to do with authority and more to do with the atmosphere of containment that pervades the camp. This is not a place where any soldier could simply forget their circumstances. The harsh reality of captivity clings to every surface, every word spoken, every movement made. It is a place designed to wear down the spirit, to break a man down not through physical violence, but through the sheer weight of disillusionment and despair. Yet, despite the constant reminder of their captivity, the prisoners hold onto a flicker of hope, an unspoken belief that something beyond this unbearable stillness will eventually change. The meals, though sparse, are consistent, rations that seem designed more to stave off hunger than to nourish the body. The food is bland and unappetizing, but the prisoners are grateful for it nonetheless. The cold, rationed water is a bitter reminder of their circumstances, and yet, it is still sustenance. In the early days, there are whispers among the men, rumors about the kind of suffering they might expect from their German captors. Some speak of other POW camps where prisoners were starved, beaten, or even forced to work in conditions that bordered on slavery. These stories, passed along like a chain of warnings, fuel their anxiety, creating an ever-present sense of fear that simmers beneath the surface. But as the days wear on, something shifts. It is subtle at first, just an occasional gesture, a moment of care in the midst of their suffering, but it begins to accumulate, altering the prisoners' perception of their captors. For the first time, some of the British soldiers notice that the German guards, though stern, are not cruel. They do not lash out with whips or fists, nor do they speak in the venomous tones that the prisoners had anticipated. Instead, they maintain an eerie calm, an almost clinical detachment as they patrol the camp. It is a form of authority that is not driven by hatred or malice but by duty, a duty that they seem to carry out with precision, without any outward sign of satisfaction or anger. To the prisoners, this is as bewildering as it is disconcerting. The British soldiers had expected the worst, screaming commands, degrading insults, physical punishment, but instead, they are met with something far less tangible: indifference. The guards' impassive faces are a source of discomfort, as if they are simply performing a function, following orders without questioning them. It is a chilling kind of efficiency that makes the prisoners question what they truly know about their captors. As the weeks turn into months, the British soldiers begin to adapt to their new reality. The fear that initially consumed them starts to fade, replaced by a dull resignation to their fate. The camp's rigid structure, though oppressive, becomes familiar, and the soldiers learn to navigate it with a sense of weary competence. They establish routines of their own, seeking small comforts where they can. The barracks, while cramped and uncomfortable, become a shared space of solidarity. They learn to look out for each other, forming bonds that transcend their nationalities and the uniforms they wear. In the silence of the nights, when the sounds of the war outside seem distant and muffled, they find moments of camaraderie, exchanging stories of home, of family, of a life that feels increasingly distant with each passing day. There is an unspoken agreement among the prisoners that, as long as they hold onto these fragments of their former lives, they will not be entirely lost to the wire that surrounds them. Despite their growing sense of adaptation, however, the British soldiers cannot ignore the growing discomfort they feel toward their captors. The suspicion remains that the Germans are simply biding their time, waiting for the right moment to break their spirits. The seeming patience of the guards is an enigma that none of the prisoners can fully decipher. Why were they not subjected to the cruelty they had been warned about? Was it part of a larger strategy to maintain control? Perhaps, the soldiers reasoned, the Germans were trying to destroy them in ways that did not involve direct violence, but something far more insidious: emotional manipulation. Perhaps they were being tested, pushed to the brink of despair not through starvation or torture, but by the subtle erosion of their will to resist. The first sign that the prisoners are being treated differently comes on a bitterly cold night, when the temperatures plummet to unbearable lows. The men are huddled in their barracks, trying to conserve warmth, when the guards arrive with blankets and extra clothing. The soldiers stare at them in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the gesture. This is not the behavior of a brutal enemy. It is something else entirely. The blankets are rough, and the clothing is simple, but they are a sign of care, a recognition that the prisoners are suffering, just as the guards are. The realization begins to settle in. The Germans are not simply enforcing their power over them, but are somehow, in their own detached way, acknowledging the shared suffering of both sides. In that moment, something shifts within the British soldiers. The harshness of their reality does not change, but the cruelty they expected, the kind of cruel, heartless oppression they had been led to believe would be their lot, begins to fade into the background. Instead, they are left to grapple with a far more complicated and unsettling truth. Their captors are not the monsters they had imagined. Lieutenant Douglas, who has spent his days observing the camp and its strange order, begins to question everything he has known about the enemy. He has witnessed the guards' calm, their patience, their methodical approach to everything from feeding the prisoners to enforcing discipline. It is not the chaotic, vengeful behavior of men driven by hate, but the cold efficiency of soldiers who have been shaped by a different set of values. He begins to see them as men caught in the same war, trapped by their own circumstances just as much as the prisoners are. The line between captor and captive, oppressor and oppressed, grows increasingly blurred. Douglas realizes that he is no longer certain where the moral boundaries lie. He has always believed that the war was a simple matter of good versus evil, of clear divisions between right and wrong. But as he watches the guards carry out their duties with a kind of detached professionalism, he starts to question whether these men are truly evil, or if they, too, are simply victims of a larger, more ruthless conflict. In the days that follow, the British soldiers begin to discuss this new understanding among themselves. There are those who are reluctant to acknowledge the humanity of their captors, who cling to the belief that they are simply playing a part in a larger scheme of cruelty. But more and more, the soldiers find themselves reflecting on the unexpected kindnesses they have received, the blankets, the food, the subtle efforts to ease their suffering. It is not the cruelty they had expected, but it is no less disconcerting for its unexpected nature. The question that lingers in their minds is no longer whether their captors are cruel, but why they are showing them this unexpected patience. What does it mean when the enemy, the very men they were taught to hate, begin to act in ways that contradict everything they had been taught to believe? The camp, with its disciplined routines and its strange sense of order, has become a place of deep moral conflict for the prisoners. Each day, they are forced to confront the fact that their reality is not as simple as they once thought. They are no longer just victims of war, they are participants in a far more complex and uncertain struggle, where the lines between right and wrong, between enemy and ally, are not easily drawn. The cruelty they feared has not materialized in the form they expected. Instead, they are left to grapple with the unsettling question of whether the true horror of war lies not in the brutality of the enemy, but in the slow erosion of their own certainties, their own moral boundaries. The days blur together, and for the British soldiers imprisoned behind the wire, time seems to stretch endlessly. There is no urgency in the routine, no sense of movement or progression, only the deep, suffocating stillness of captivity. The prisoners, once full of fear and rage at their unexpected capture, now find themselves confronting an emotion more disorienting than anything they had anticipated: confusion. The Germans who guard them, despite their stern appearances and unwavering discipline, seem almost indifferent to the prisoners' suffering. They do not lash out, they do not yell. They go through their duties with a clinical precision that is almost unnerving. It's not that the guards show kindness, at least not in any form that could be easily understood. They don't smile or try to make conversation with the prisoners. They don't offer words of comfort or make any attempt at casual pleasantries. But there is something in their demeanor that starts to unnerve the British soldiers: patience. These German guards, who are expected to be the embodiment of cruelty and authoritarianism, seem instead to take a quiet, almost distant interest in maintaining the camp's order and structure. There is no question in the guards' minds as to who is in control of the camp, but there's no vindictive malice in their eyes. They don't beat the prisoners for minor infractions, nor do they punish them for showing signs of resistance. There is no open cruelty. In fact, They are often meticulous in ensuring that the prisoner's needs are met, even if those needs are basic and minimal. Lieutenant Douglas, ever the observer, feels the weight of this strange behavior more acutely than most. A soldier by trade, he was trained to see the world in black and white. The enemy is the enemy, and there are no moral ambiguities in war. Yet, as he watches the guards carry out their duties, he begins to question everything he once knew. In his training, the German soldier was supposed to be the embodiment of brutality, emotionless, driven only by orders, indifferent to the suffering they cause. But these men, his captors, are different. There is no outward sign of sadism, no evidence of the cruelty he had come to expect. They do not speak with malice, they do not strike with rage, and they do not revel in the pain of others. They seem, at times, almost as weary as the prisoners themselves. The guards don't appear to be in any hurry to break them down or to create suffering. In fact, the longer Douglas observes them, the more he begins to see something in their eyes, something that unsettles him deeply. There is no doubt in Douglas's mind that these guards, too, are men of war. They have been trained to follow orders without question, just as the British soldiers were. But unlike his fellow captives, who are still struggling to make sense of their captivity, Douglas finds himself struck by the eerie patience that pervades the atmosphere of the camp. It is as if the soldiers are not merely fulfilling their duty, but have resigned themselves to a grim kind of understanding, that they, too, are just cogs in a machine far larger than themselves, trapped by circumstances that are beyond anyone's control. The idea that the guards may feel the weight of this war in the same way the prisoners do begins to haunt Douglas's thoughts. These men, who are supposed to be his enemies, might actually share in the same burdens, the same moral dilemmas. And if that is the case, then perhaps the distinction between them and us isn't as clear-cut as he once believed. In the following days, as Douglas continues his quiet observations, he begins to notice more subtle behaviors. When one of the prisoners falls ill, it is the German medic who comes to their aid, offering basic care and even some comfort in the form of a few extra rations. There is no malicious joy in the medic's eyes, no sign of cruelty in his movements. Instead, the man carries out his task with a clinical detachment that seems entirely professional. He does not seem to be acting out of compassion, but rather out of some deeper sense of duty, one that perhaps mirrors the same sense of duty that binds the British soldiers to their cause. This is not to say that the prisoners are receiving care out of the kindness of the guards' hearts, far from it, but it's a recognition of the soldiers' humanity in a way that none of the prisoners expected. The medic does not treat the sick soldier as less than human, as an enemy to be ignored or abandoned, but as someone who simply needs help. And that, in itself, is a troubling realization. As the weeks drag on, the prisoners begin to feel the weight of this growing uncertainty. They had expected their experience in captivity to be one of suffering, of violence, and of constant oppression. But the longer they are held, the more it becomes apparent that the Germans are not treating them with the brutality they anticipated. Instead, there is a strange and unsettling sense of order, one that is maintained not by fear or rage, but by an almost academic precision. The guards enforce rules not with punishment, but with the kind of stoic professionalism that Douglas has seen in his own army. There is no cruelty, but neither is there warmth. There is only the cold, calculating efficiency of men performing their duties. At night, when the camp falls into its eerie silence, the British soldiers often lie awake, contemplating the situation they find themselves in. The absence of cruelty, of direct oppression, is disorienting. It forces them to ask questions they had never considered before. Are these men, these German guards, really so different from themselves? What would it mean if the enemy soldiers, like themselves, were simply doing their duty, caught in the same war machine? What if, beneath the discipline and the orders, these men are simply like them, struggling to maintain some semblance of humanity in the face of an inhumane war? Douglas's mind races with these questions, and he begins to reach out to other prisoners, engaging them in quiet conversations that, at first, feel like acts of defiance, but soon become something much more profound. He talks to them not only about the war, but about the guards, about the strange, unsettling calm that permeates the camp. The conversations are hesitant at first, But as the soldiers begin to open up, a shared understanding begins to take shape. There is something beyond the suffering, beyond the humiliation of being captured. It is a quiet recognition that the war they are fighting may not be as simple as they once thought. The lines between the enemy and themselves are becoming more and more difficult to distinguish. The guards may be their captors, but they are also men. Men who, like the British soldiers, are struggling in the midst of a war that offers little room for clarity or understanding. Douglas finds himself revisiting his earlier assumptions. In the beginning, he had thought of the war as a conflict between good and evil, between the British, who were fighting for freedom, and the Germans, who represented tyranny and oppression. But as he spends more time in the camp, he begins to see the war in a different light. It is not a clear-cut battle of good versus evil, but a complex, messy conflict that forces men to question their values, their beliefs, and their actions. The Germans are not the faceless monsters he had been led to believe. They are human beings, caught up in the same horrors of war. And as much as the prisoners may resent their captors for their role in this war, they cannot ignore the fact that the men who guard them are, in many ways, no different from themselves. This growing awareness shifts the dynamic within the camp. The British soldiers begin to see their captors through a different lens, and the cold indifference they once feared becomes something else entirely, a reflection of their own shared humanity. They are no longer simply enemies. They are men, trapped in a conflict that has left little room for moral certainty. The recognition of this shared struggle, the understanding that both sides are equally ensnared by the same terrible fate, begins to erode the walls of hatred that had once defined the conflict in their minds. The wire, which had initially seemed like an impenetrable barrier between the prisoners and their captors, now feels like a reminder of something deeper, the inescapable reality of war, where both sides are victims and perpetrators, bound by forces beyond their control. Douglas continues to observe the guards, searching for signs of the cruelty he had expected. Yet, the more he watches them, the less he is able to find. There are moments when he thinks he sees something in their eyes, a flicker of empathy, perhaps, or the weight of their own burden, but they are fleeting. The German guards remain as enigmatic as ever, their stoic faces giving little away. Still, the realization grows within him that the war they are fighting is not as simple as he once believed. It is a war that forces men to grapple with questions of morality, of duty, and of survival, and in that struggle, it becomes harder and harder to tell who the real enemies are. As the days pass, the line between captor and captive begins to dissolve, leaving only the weary men who are caught in the same inescapable tide of history. The biting cold of winter continues to grip the camp, and with each passing day, the British soldiers grow more aware of their vulnerability. The air is thick with a chill that seems to seep into their bones, and as the temperatures plummet to life-threatening lows, survival becomes a constant concern. The thin walls of their barracks offer little protection against the harsh elements outside, and the prisoners find themselves huddling together in tight clusters, trying to preserve what little warmth they can. The guards, whose indifference had once been unsettling, now appear in a new light. They, too, are vulnerable to the cruel weather, and in the stillness of the camp, the British soldiers begin to notice something that they had not observed before, the shared suffering of both sides. The cold does not discriminate. It numbs everyone, regardless of nationality or allegiance. It is on one particularly frigid night that something unexpected happens. The storm that had been brewing for hours finally breaks, unleashing a torrent of snow that blankets the camp in an unrelenting layer of white. The wind howls through the wire, sending icy gusts through every crack and crevice. The prisoners, already exhausted and malnourished, find themselves in a battle not just for survival, but against the brutal forces of nature itself. The already difficult conditions have now become almost unbearable. The cold cuts through their thin clothing, and the ground beneath their feet turns to a slippery, frozen expanse. For the first time since their capture, the British soldiers are faced with the harsh reality that their bodies, weakened by hunger and deprivation, are no match for the fierce power of the elements. In the midst of the storm, the soldiers begin to feel a creeping sense of despair. Their survival, once something they could control, now feels precarious, dependent not on their strength or willpower, but on forces beyond their control. The storm, a natural enemy far more indifferent than any German soldier, seems to mock their efforts to endure. The thin blankets they have been given offer little comfort, their ragged clothes no match for the sub-zero temperatures. For the first time since their capture, they begin to question how much longer they can survive in this unforgiving environment. The food, already sparse, is no match for the hunger gnawing at their stomachs, and the days of exposure to the elements are beginning to take their toll. But just when they believe that the storm will be the final blow, something remarkable occurs. The German guards, who have been patrolling the wire as usual, begin to take action. At first, it is a small gesture, an extra blanket for one of the sick soldiers, a few more rations of bread passed through the fence. But as the night wears on, the scale of the response becomes clear. The guards are not only aware of the soldiers' suffering, they are responding to it. They begin to distribute additional supplies, blankets, and clothing to the prisoners, ensuring that no one is left exposed to the brutal cold. They organize makeshift shelters, using whatever materials they have on hand, to create a semblance of warmth for the men. And as the storm continues to rage outside, the prisoners are given the first real taste of mercy they have experienced since their capture. The warmth they receive is not just physical, it is a recognition of their humanity, an acknowledgement that the soldiers on both sides of the wire are caught in the same struggle for survival. At first, the British soldiers are bewildered by this gesture. It is not the kind of treatment they had expected from their captors. The food, the blankets, the protection from the elements, these are things that the prisoners had come to believe would never be offered to them. The Germans, in their eyes, had always been the enemy, the faceless force that had imprisoned them and threatened their lives. Yet here they were, offering help in the form of simple acts of kindness. It is not the kind of mercy that the prisoners had hoped for. There are no grand gestures, no speeches of goodwill, no promises of freedom. But it is something that they had not anticipated: patience, care, and a recognition that, even in the midst of war, there is still room for human decency. Lieutenant Douglas, who had been observing the situation with growing curiosity, finds himself deeply unsettled by this turn of events. His entire understanding of the war, of the enemy, begins to unravel in the face of this unexpected kindness. He had always believed that the Germans were driven solely by hatred and a thirst for conquest. They were the other side, the enemy, the ones who would stop at nothing to break the will of the British people. But now, in the midst of this storm, he begins to see something different. The guards are not simply fulfilling a duty imposed upon them by a cruel regime, they are responding to the same cold, the same hunger, the same human need that the prisoners themselves are struggling with. They are not just soldiers in an army, they are men, bound by the same frailties and limitations as the men they guard. Douglas cannot help but question the assumptions that have defined his entire worldview. For so long, he has believed that the lines between good and evil were clear, that the British were the righteous ones fighting against the forces of tyranny. But as he watches the guards offer warmth and sustenance to the prisoners, he begins to wonder whether this war is really as black and white as he had been taught. The Germans, it seems, are not the monsters he had envisioned, and the British soldiers, once so sure of their moral superiority, are now forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the enemy they face may not be so different from themselves. The prisoners, too, are left grappling with this moral dilemma. The gesture of kindness from the German guards is so unexpected, so out of place, that it leaves them in a state of confusion. How are they supposed to respond to this? For so long, they have seen their captors as the embodiment of evil, as representatives of a regime that seeks nothing but destruction. But now, in the face of this simple, yet profound act of compassion, they are forced to reconsider their understanding of the enemy. There is no clear answer, no simple way to reconcile this kindness with the larger picture of the war. But the act itself cannot be ignored. It lingers in the minds of the prisoners, a reminder that even in the most dire of circumstances, there is always the possibility for something more than mere survival. There is the possibility for empathy, for connection, for shared humanity. As the storm begins to subside and the snow settles into a thick blanket over the camp, the soldiers find themselves reflecting on what they have just experienced. The cold, which had seemed so overwhelming and insurmountable, has become a shared experience, something that unites them with the very people who had once been their enemies. The guards, who had been little more than faceless figures in the prisoners' minds, are now something else, human beings caught in the same merciless storm, struggling to survive in a world that offers no easy answers. The prisoners may still be captives, but the walls that separated them from their captors have begun to erode. The cold, the hunger, the shared struggle to endure, it all becomes a kind of equalizer, a reminder that, despite the brutal realities of war, there is still a capacity for kindness, for patience, for recognition of the suffering of others. In the days that follow, the British soldiers begin to reflect more deeply on the relationship between captor and captive. The kindness they have received from the guards does not erase the fact that they are prisoners, nor does it change the fact that they are at war with these men. But it does shift something fundamental within them. They are no longer simply victims of war. They are participants in something far more complex, a struggle not just for survival, but for the preservation of their humanity. The Germans are no longer simply the enemy. They are men, bound by the same forces of war and circumstance. The realization is a painful one, but it is also a liberating one.